I'm ready. Hello everyone, welcome to our live video for Tuesday. Happy November. It's hard to believe it's already here. I did want to share with you a couple of things before we get started. First of all, if you are wanting to get started on a Halloween project for next year, I have a fat quarter stack that includes 15 Halloween fat quarters that you can get here at the shop so you can get started for next year. It's got some really cool little eyeball fabrics. There's a purple one and a black one that are kind of fun and different. So that's something we have new. And Tony's been busy today adding new fabric. We got quite a few things to go on our tone-on-tone color wall. So come by and see them. There were too many for me to take pictures of. So she put on about 40 bolts of fabric. So come by and see them. Say that again. Oh, Tony's reminding me we do have a panel of Hot Wheels that you can make a fun little whimsical quilt. Now, the quilt you just finished, yes, I want to show Tony's been working on a sample for the shop. So she's going to go get that. And we have a couple of coordinating pieces that go with the Hot Wheel panel. Most of the things we have in, other than some Edita Sitar basics, are tone-on-tones, like I said. And so they're going to be in the classroom area with all of the assorted colors. But we did get quite a few red, white, and blue pieces that we put in the Americana. So Tony has a quilt. I'm going to turn this camera around so you can see it. She has a quilt that she's been working on. Hang on a second. Let me get to the right camera so you can see it. It is part of the Quilt Cafe, Fabric Cafe, I think is the name of the company. They have a line of books called, they're based on 3 1-yard cuts of fabric. So super simple, fast and easy. She did the middle of the quilt in one day and then put the borders on the next time she was here. So that's one of the kits we have, and we put together several kits that you can pick from. Oh, she brought the Hot Wheels panel, because you can just grab a panel, put some borders around it, make a fun pillow out of the coordinating fabrics, and get them a little Hot Wheels car to go with it, and they can drive all over the quilt. So that's something that came in today. So things that you can check out here at the shop. The other thing I wanted to share with you is the class, the New York Beauty class for this coming Thursday is full. That's the one on the left. But the class for the Morning Star, which is November 12th, is not full yet. That's the one on the right. It uses the wedge star tool, super fun to make and much easier than you might think. And the points come out nice and precise. And the gals that took the class were all really happy with what they got accomplished during the class. So for today, we are doing a project called Whimsy Turndash. And I stuck one of the blocks up here in a different color combination that I used for the shop sample. Because all of my samples that I'm working on are red, white, and blue. Of course, you could just substitute the orange for red, and you could make something similar. The center of this particular picture is just a plain square, where the one we're doing today has a square in a square. And we'll talk about that in a second. So we'll come back to that screen in a little bit. I'm going to go to the overhead camera so you can kind of see the block, the sample that we did for the shop. And I wanted to talk a little bit about when you are looking at a pattern. A lot of times a pattern will tell you that you need a 4.5-inch square for the center. But you have to determine, does that mean 4.5 inches finished or unfinished? Because that will affect what you need to start with. So this particular block is a 12-inch finished block, which means all 3 of my segments going both directions have to finish 4 inches. I'm going to move this off here so you can see that it's a full square. And each of these units have to finish 4 inches in order for that block to be a 12-inch finished block. But that means that at this point, before it is assembled into a block, this is 4.5 inches from edge to edge. The points of my square in the middle are 4 inches from point to point, but I need that extra half inch or 1/4 inch on both sides for my seam allowance. This one will finish at 4 inches and come right to the tip of that little house. And but that means at this point it measures 4.5 inches from side to side and top to bottom. This half square finishes at 4 inches, but right now it measures 4.5 because you have to have that seam allowance. So when you are looking at a pattern, it's good to determine whether they're talking about finished sizes after the whole unit is in the quilt block, or if they're talking about the size the unit is before you assemble the block, because it will make a difference. Today's block is going to be using the square squared tool for a couple of different things. We're going to talk about that. One is just a basic square and a square, and that's kind of a review from last week. The other is the little houses technique, and that is a technique sheet that's available. The technique sheets will have a little icon on the side to tell you what tool it needs, and then there's a level of difficulty indicator. There's some 1-star technique sheets. There's even some 5-star technique sheets, but don't let that scare you. The instructions are very good. Generally, they give you pattern information, they give you sizing information, and then you can sit down with your technique sheet and a cup of coffee and watch a video from Studio 180 Design. And Deb talks about this technique and how you use the tool in order to accomplish that. I'm going to walk you through that for today. The technique sheets are available here at the shop, and we'll be glad to help you with the ones you need. There's about 25 of them, so not all the tools have multiple technique sheets available, but most of them have more than one technique sheet that you can use with that tool. So I got out my samples of units just to show you the different sizes of blocks you can make or units you can make with these tools. So this is my square squared sample for this size. And remember, there is a square squared 1/2 inch tool that will do the in-between sizes and on up for 8 more sizes. There is also the larger version that will go up to a 12-inch block with just the square squared. Plus, there are several technique sheets that you can use with the square squared tool. The Tucker trimmer will do 12 different sizes. And so we are doing this 4-inch finished half square unit, but you could do the hourglass unit in that size or any one of the 12 sizes you see here. Also, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about if you are struggling knowing what to cut. Say you want to make your half square in a different size. The one for our Whimsy Turndash block is a 4-inch finished, but you may want to decide to do that block in a different size. All you would have to do is change the size of your starting squares that you're using. So I have the instruction sheet that comes with the Tucker trimmer. So there are 3 Tucker trimmers. We carry all of them, and we have all of them in stock all of the time. But the instruction sheet that comes with the Tucker trimmer 1 looks like this. It's a long piece of paper with lots of information. It also has a chart for sizing information that is very helpful. If this gets lost, you can actually download 8.5 inch by 11 inch sheets from their website. And I did this today just to show you. And you can grab just the sizing chart, because once you use this 2 or 3 times, a lot of times you don't refer to the information that's the instruction sheet. You just refer to the sizing information. So it is possible to print yourself out a chart just to have it handy. There is a separate chart for the Tucker Trimmer 2. Now that one makes units that finish at something and a quarter or something and 3/4. So like 2 1/4 or 2 3/4 or 3 1/4 or 3 3/4 and like that. And it gives sizing information for what you cut. So just a kind of reminder that we've used before. If you remember this chart that I showed you, there are 3 basic rows of information that you're going to be using. One of them is the top one, and that's the half square units. And if you're going to do half squares, if you start with squares that are 1 inch larger than what you want to finish with, you'll have just a tiny sliver to trim away. The combination unit and the quarter square unit or hourglass unit, if you'll use a square that is 1 1/2 inches larger, then you have plenty of trimming room. And some people just have a blanket 1 1/4 inch larger, just or 1 1/2 inch larger, just to make it easier, instead of having one measurement for the half square and something different for the combination unit. But the really cool thing is you don't have to come up with those on your own for these 12-inch blocks, because I'm giving you your sizing information that you need. So I have my plate. I stuck it back here behind me, and I'm ready to start assembling the units I need for the Whimsy Turndash. So here's my plate, and I've got my printout. I printed this from the cutting information that you're going to get. And notice there's a little correction here. Your paper is already corrected. As I was cutting through these, I find a few typos that I've had to fix, but that gives me a chance to correct them before I pass them on to you. So we have a lot of hellos from Florida, and I know some of you are from closer by. I just happened to glance over and see some comments. It's always fun to see where you're from. Okay, so I have... I'm going to start with the half squares, I think. That's the easiest way to start. So I have got some squares that are 5 inches because I want to have a finished 4-inch half square unit. On this, my magic wand that I've broken in half will not fit across that square. So I can't use that. If I'm going to use that half magic wand, it's pretty well going to have to be something that is finishing as a 3-inch unit, and I have enough room to get across that. And then I'm going to grab my marking tool. I'm using a gel pen, a fine line gel pen, and I'm using a bright orange color. You probably can't see it, but it is bright orange. And I'm going to draw my lines on, and we're going to just go across both sides. And we had somebody in class not too long ago, and she was doing half squares, and she was left-handed, but she did a lot of things right-handed. So she would use her magic wand, and she'd draw this side, and then she'd switch hands and draw this side. I was so jealous because I can't do that. I'm going to assemble this. Tony's laughing at me. By putting my squares together, and you can barely see my orange. I'm surprised that you can't see that more because it is neon orange. And I'm going to stitch right down my line. And I typically tell people I'm actually stitching with my needle touching the inside of that line, because I want to keep that channel between my 2 lines of stitching very narrow, so I have room to get my trimming done at the end of my process. So my needle is just traveling right down the inside of my line. And I'm going to grab the other one because I'm going to do assembly line stitching. That's always more efficient. By the way, I don't know that I remembered to tell you, if you want to join us for the class on the 12th, make sure you call us so I can get the supply list sent to you and you'll be prepared for the class. So we're going to go to the end, and I could grab my fabric tag, part my needle, and turn around. I typically just sew across the bottom and then flip it around and go back the other way. And once I get that done, I have all the stitching I need to do completed on my half square units. And we're going to go. And then this time I'm going to part my needle. I still have my fabric tag from when I started. I'm just going to sew onto my fabric tag and part my needle. And I'm ready to go to the ironing surface and cut this and press it and trim it. So let's see what that's going to look like. So I'm going to need to grab my cutter and something to cut against. I can cut against the side of my tucker trimmer. All I have to do is cut from point to point. And I'm ready to press. Now the inside, the seam that I just sewed is actually a bias seam, so I want to be real careful when I press this that I don't distort my block. So I typically open it up and give it just a little finger press so that I know the seam is going the way I want it to go. Set the iron on it and get the next one ready. Set the iron on it, and I typically just stack them up and then finger press that one. And if you've got several that you can stack up like this, I'm just putting the edge of my seam right against the seam where I pressed the one before, and I can set that on there. I can also grab my acorn pressing pin, give it a swipe, put this one down. If you've ever watched me in class, I actually do this a lot, where I put one unit down, use my acorn pressing pin, and while it's working, get the next one ready. And I just did 2 at a time. Doesn't take a lot of time, but it gives me nice, crisp seams that way. So I'm ready to trim this. I'm going to be using my tucker trimmer. So all I have to do for half squares is line up my diagonal seam on my tool with the diagonal, or the diagonal line on my tool with the diagonal seam on my unit. Now I have just a tiny sliver to trim away here. And that's what I was talking about when I said some people like to give themselves just a little more wiggle room, so they actually cut a 1.5 inch larger. I've been doing this long enough, I just cut 1 and it works out okay. I'm not going to cut a lot off anyway, just because of the process I'm using. So I'm going to get rid of that. Sometimes about all I cut off is just the ears that I would have had to cut off with my scissors anyway. So I'm going to do that with all 4 pieces. The half circle goes on the top corner on the right, since I'm right-handed, and I'm actually trimming this to 4.5 inches. Remember, because you've got to make sure you have your seam allowance included in that. And now this time I've got the 4.5 inch cleanup lines right on my cut edges. I've got my diagonal seam aligned with my diagonal line on my tucker trimmer, and you can just whip through these really quickly that way. If you find that you struggle having enough to trim away, just bump up your beginning square, and then you should be fine. I don't have an issue with this, but some people just want a little more wiggle room, which is perfectly fine. So you see, I just almost just give it a little shave right there. Doesn't take a lot. Now if you're left-handed, you're simply going to turn the half circle icon to the top left corner. You're going to line up the same way. You're going to make sure that your 4.5 inch lines line up on the outside. Make sure you have plenty of room within that 4.5 inch square. And I do, so I'm going to just cut. Notice I turned it back to the right because I'm not left-handed. And I'm going to line that up. I have 4 perfectly aligned and trimmed half square units to go in my block, and it didn't take very long to do it. So if I wanted to make this block a 9-inch block, that would mean all of my half squares and every other unit in the block would need to finish at 3 inches. I could make a 6-inch block. I could make I have to do my math really quick, a 7-inch block, and then all of my units would need to be finishing at 2.5. So you have lots of options for how you could use this block. So the next one we're going to do is this basic square squared unit. So just as a review, let's talk about the square squared tool. There are 2 sections of the tool. If you're using the large square squared, this part of the tool is one piece of plastic. This part of the tool is a different piece of plastic. So with the original size, that's this one, I have all of my information on my tool. The instruction sheet that comes with it will basically walk you through the process of what you do with your pieces, but all of my information about what I need to cut is right on my tool. If I need a center for a 4-inch finished unit, here's my center square for my 4-inch block, and I need to cut that from 3.5-inch strips. Now last week I had a strip because I cut several center squares. For this one I just need 1 square. So I've got a 3.5-inch square, and all I'm going to do is true up that square using I'm going to turn around this way and I'll show you why, using the center square for 4-inch blocks. If your square is pretty true and it's not raveled, you can actually just trim off 2 sides, up and over. If it's kind of gotten raveledy on the edge, you're going to want to trim all the way around just enough to get a nice square. So there's my center. It is cut to the precise size I need. It's often a strange size that's not even on your ruler. So that's the purpose of this template for your center square. And you cut that with the A section of your square squared. And I just took a Sharpie and marked that on my tool. Now for my corners, my light blue corners, I can look on my chart right here. For a 4-inch finished unit, I can cut 3 1/4-inch squares. There's my 3 1/4-inch squares, and I'm going to just stack them up. I only need 2 for this, and I'm going to cut corner to corner. And once I get that done, I'm ready to stitch. So I'm going to take this back over to the sewing area and change the camera so you can see what I'm doing. So here is my center. This is the one thing that I said last week is a little awkward at first. You want to sew with the square on top and the triangle on bottom. Typically, I guess when I first started quilting, I had them going this way through the machine, and a lot of patterns would tell you to pinch and make a mark or put a little crease there. You don't really have to do that with this technique because this triangle is oversized and you have enough room to trim off that part of that unit that you don't need. So we're going to just stitch off of our fabric tag onto our triangle and square, and I am lining up with the edge of my patchwork foot. It's a 1/4-inch patchwork foot, but you do need to kind of be aware of where you need to align your fabric to get your perfect 1/4-inch. I've sewn enough that I know where that is, but every machine's just a little bit different. And if for some reason you have to switch machines in the middle of the project, you need to check your 1/4-inch seam allowance because it may not be in the same place that you found it before on a different machine. So I'm doing the opposite side, and I just turned it around. The triangle still goes on bottom, the square goes on top, and I'm aligning the edge of the square, and I'm using my foot to glide along the edge of the square. I'm really not paying attention to where the triangle is. It should be lined up in a perfect world, but I'm actually following the square. So at this point, if I was doing a bunch of these, say 20 or so of them, I'd probably take this to the ironing board and press them all. Since I'm just doing one, I'm just going to give it a little finger press. And I'm giving a crease at about a 1/2 inch at a time. You don't want to take your finger and drag all the way across here, or you're going to end up making yourself unhappy because it's going to distort your block. Betty says, I sound great tonight. For those of you who have been watching for a while, I've been having a sound issue. I had to get a new part, but we got it all worked out, so yay, we have sound. Technology. And you know, it actually broke several weeks ago when we had no sound at all, and I didn't realize that my computer was compensating for the fact that my microphone wasn't really working. I just didn't realize that. But we're good now. All right, so I've put the other pieces on, and I'm going right along here. I'm using my 1/4 inch patchwork foot to follow along the edge of my square. And notice I had a different fabric tag. I generally have a couple of them on my sewing machine, and I just go from one to the other. Because usually I can find at least one of them. And I'm aligning my triangle underneath. If you'll get yourself in the habit of sewing with the square on top all the way around, you'll be more precise in your sewing, so your trimming will work better as well. So I have the whole squared unit ready to press and trim. So we're going to the overhead camera so you can see what I do next. So this one, I'm going to first of all give it just a quick little finger press again, because you want to make sure that you don't distort that seam. Finger pressing before you press with your iron is always a good idea, no matter what you're doing. And it gives you a chance to make sure there's no little tucks in your seam and everything is lined up the way you want it to. So we're just going to go right along all the edges and set the iron on, let the iron do the work. So you notice I'm not moving and sawing with my iron. That's what you want, because you want to make sure that you're nice and square. So on this unit, again, it needs to be trimmed to 4.5 inches, but its finished size is 4. So on my tool, on the trim down area, that's the B section, there are a couple of things to look for. One is I have a bunch of X's that say 4. That's the indicator of my finished size. But if you look right here, this square says 4.5. That's the indicator of the size I'm actually trimming to. But if I put all of those X's with the 4s on them on the intersections on my squared unit, let those line up and just tweak it till it lines up really nicely, then I have room to trim all the way around. I'm going to trim 2 sides, get rid of those little slivers. That leaves me with the precise 1/4 inch I need at the points. I turn 180 degrees. Now this time I'm lining up the 4.5. Again, I put all of the 4 X's, that's my indicator of my finished size. Those go on the intersections of all my points. I have my 4-inch finished unit. Right now it measures 4.5, and it's going to line up perfectly with my half squares that are going to go on the corners. So the other unit we're going to be using today is a little house. You might find it in another pattern turned the other way. I grabbed a pattern. This is one of Deb's patterns. It's called Southern Hospitality, and it actually uses a lot of little houses, but looking at them you may think they're flying geese. So right here there's a couple of little houses with green points and a kind of a buttery yellow edge. In the center there are some little houses that have a white house with little green corners. So there are a lot of pieces in this quilt called Southern Hospitality that use that little house technique. So that's one of the patterns we have in. To make this, you could actually use the corner pop tool, but it actually is I think, easier to use the little house technique and just trim it with the square tool. So let me show you how that looks. I've got some squares of red. I need one square. I'm going to put this over here so you can see it. I need one square of red for each little house that I'm making. Oh, Tony's telling me to move the camera down. I finally did. So I need one square of red for my little house, or whatever color you're using. That first picture I showed you, it was orange. And then I need 2 squares of whatever color is going to make my points of my little house, or the sky if you're thinking of it being a little house. And so in my stack I have 8 little squares and I have 4 big squares. All I'm going to do is grab my magic wand, and this time I can actually use my half magic wand. I think I'll get a color a little darker. Let's get this one so you can maybe see it. So you want to make sure you draw on the wrong side, and I only need one line across each of my squares. So basically, if you think about this as a square squared with only 2 triangles, that's actually what it's going to look like. You just get to the process a little bit differently so that you can trim off the excess that you don't need for this project. So that's all you're going to have to do with these squares, is draw one line. You don't have to draw 2 because you're going to only stitch one line across. Sometimes I do this ahead of time, but I didn't today. And 2 more, and I'll have enough for all of my little houses. You need 2 squares of whatever's your points for every big square. And I have 4 big squares and 8 little squares. So now all I have to do is line up my little square up in the corner and stitch along that line. And assembly line style is going to be your best, most efficient way. And I'm just stitching right along my line and continue. Like that. Now when you're doing little houses, it's a 2-step process. And if you're doing several of them, you want to do the first step for all of them before you go to the second step. Notice there's a little bit of white on this square. That was at the edge of my fabric, and that's actually the part of the selvage. That's going to get trimmed away, so I didn't worry too much about getting that all trimmed off. But you don't want to use the selvage in your project. It doesn't play like the rest of your fabric. So you would want to make sure that's either going to get trimmed off during the trimming process, or you need to cut it off before you start. So at this point, there's one of my triangles. So the first thing I need to do is trim that off. You can either grab a pair of scissors and cut the excess off first, and then flip this back, and I'm going to give it just a little finger press. And then I'm going to do that with all of them. If I'm doing this as a general rule, I'm going to grab some sort of a cutting guide. Let me grab, and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to use my rotary cutter and trim off the excess. You just trim 1/4 of an inch from that seam, and you could actually save that extra little piece if you wanted to. It would actually make a tiny half square. So you could do that. I'm not going to today. I'm going to get rid of them and move on to the next step. So I would just quickly trim off the excess. You just want to make sure you don't trim on this side of the stitching, or you're going to be making it again. So I've got one of them ready to do the second step. And all I need to do is quickly give them a finger press. If you need to, you can take them to your ironing surface and press them before you do the next step, but you have to flip this back. I'll show you why. I'm going to do this one without flipping it back. So if I put the next square on and sew it, I'm trapping this triangle down. So that's why you have to make sure that you flip back your first triangle before you add the second one. So I'm going to add the second one, line that up, and it's going to cross over that first triangle edge, which is the way you want it. So I'm going to stitch along my line, grab the next one, and stitch. When you finger press it, you want to make sure that you've got that creased back and you don't have any little tucks there in that seam that will make it not lay down flat. And we'll grab one more. No, I have two more. So get ready to do this one and just stitch from corner to corner on my white squares. And here's my last one. Just grab that, line it up, and feed it through. Now again, I'm going to need to trim away see, I said I can usually find a fabric tag. I'm hunting for one. There's my fabric tag. We're going to park our needle. And again, I'm going to trim off that excess corner that I don't need. And like I said, I would do that with my rotary cutter, but if you want to do it with your scissors, that will work as well. So you're actually going to be trimming off a tiny bit of that triangle that's underneath. So don't be worried when you see a little bit of that the triangle on the other side. I guess I could move this over here so you could see. And there you can see a tiny bit of that first triangle. It's going to be fine. You don't need that part anyway, because that's going to be within the seam allowance of your little house unit anyway. So now I'm ready to go to the ironing surface, press this and trim it, and I'm going to be trimming it with my square tool. So you want to give it a quick little finger press to flip that triangle back. And so it doesn't take a lot, just enough to crease it so that the seam is going the way you want it to go for the trimming process. And you want to, if you're using the acorn pressing pin, now would be the time to grab that. I would probably not use the acorn pressing pin after I've got it trimmed on these seams. I might use it at a further time, but I would, if I'm going to use it before I trim my unit. So here's what this looks like. This needs to be a 4-inch finished unit. I'm going to be trimming it to 4.5. So it's like 1 point on my little house. I orient mine pointing up like a little house would look, and I find the X for the size I'm finishing. So I'll need to put the number 4 on there, and the lines that line up with the 4s that are on the sides, they should line up with your side seams. And I can trim up and over. Now I'm going to turn my house 180 degrees. This time my little house point is on the bottom 4, or whatever size you're making. And again, your side 4s will be on the seam, and I'm trimming to 4.5 inches. Right there's my indicator of what size I'm trimming to. So you don't have a lot of waste on this. Again, I put my little house rooftop at the top, and I'm going to trim up and over. This is actually going to end up in my seam, but I'm not worried about it because I've cut off the part of the selvage that's really kind of stiff and it just doesn't crease and lay down like the rest of the fabric. So I don't use it if I can help it. So I would always point at the top, but there's nothing that says you couldn't do it this way. I just keep myself oriented by pointing to the roof, but I'm going to show you that it really doesn't matter if you get one twisted. Then you would point to the right first and then turn it to the left. And you're still lining up with the number 4 because that's my finished size. Now, if I happen to be left-handed, I'm simply going to turn my tool vertically so that I can put the number 4 on my rooftop, just like I did. There we go. I would trim up the left side and across the top. I'm not going to try that. I'm just going to turn my whole thing around so I don't have to try to cut left-handed because that would be bad. And I'm going up and over, right side first, and then across the top of whatever I've got underneath my tool, and turn and 180 degrees, line up on the 4.5. Again, check the number for the finished size I want, and I have a perfectly trimmed little house unit ready to go in my project. Now, if you decided you wanted to make your Whimsy Turndash look a little different than mine, that is perfectly fine. Here's what it looks like if you're using the pattern. I'm going to grab one of these that doesn't have the little white strip on it, just to keep you from being confused. So here's what the original pattern looks like. So when you get the pattern downloaded from Studio 180 Design, they're going to have several color combinations of this block. But I might decide I want this to look different. So the first thing I'm going to do is just turn my little houses pointing in. I want you to notice what happens. It'll create a little star. Depending on what size or what colors you pick, this could be a fun little pattern. So that one creates a little white star in the middle. You may decide to arrange your Whimsy Turndash units this way and make a little star in the middle. I can also flip these around and it creates not really a star. You don't really see the little houses anymore. It's another combination that you could use. You could also turn these a quarter turn. I'm going to turn this back around to the bottom. Because you can change the color combinations as well. In your cutting instructions, it'll tell you what fabric you need, and it has an indicator of what color I used, because you may decide to use a different color. If you turn these a quarter turn like this, it's going to have a secondary pattern of a little pinwheel in the corners. So you have lots of options for what you could do. Real quickly, I'm going to show you a couple of different options that you could do. And you could put together a block totally different than mine. These are just a couple of alternate projects. So the orange and blue is basically like what I had to start with, but the blue, instead of being on the inside, is on the outside. So you could create a whole project. If you look carefully at this, it's actually a Whimsy Turndash with a Tennessee Waltz block in between. The Tennessee Waltz block includes that V block unit, the spiky unit, and we'll be learning that one in next week maybe. And then it also has a lot of 4 patches, but that is your basic Tennessee Waltz block with the Whimsy Turndash in between. This one is a similar look with different fabric, and that was just something I saw somewhere. But I like to show you different projects using the basic block. I don't know if most of you saw in the comments from last week's, I saw a quilt, I think it was on somebody's, it was Tula, on her video that she showed. So a lot of the basic units we're using, you can see them in a lot of quilts, and you can see lots of inspiration for how you could put together your units to make a block either exactly like the Whimsy Turndash picture, or you can put them together in a different way so you get a different look. So that is something that you can think about. Next week we'll be doing block 8, and so until then, happy sewing. Be sure and come see us and check out all the new tone on tone fabrics, and we will see you next week live at 5.